Hey everybody, today I'm going to talk about the new book from Brazos Press, written by Mike Cosper, called The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement. Thank you to Brazos for sending me a copy of this for review. I was very, very interested in this, and I'm going to give you my honest reaction to it through my typical format of talking about the main idea of the book, the research that is behind it, the readability style, and then my general reactions at the end. So let's dive into this one. So Mike Cosper, most of you watching, I'm guessing, are going to be somewhat familiar with him, particularly as the person behind the podcast that absolutely blew up a few years ago called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It was absolutely everywhere, even outside of just strictly Christian circles. A lot of people were listening to it. I listened to the whole thing. I liked it, and I defend it to people who critique it. I think there are some fair critiques of it, but I overall think it was a very good project that was well done. That's another conversation for another time, but I just wanted to put it out front there. I had a positive reaction to that podcast, and so I was primed to be interested in this book from Mike. I also liked his memoir he recently released through IVP called Land of My Sojourn. I thought that one was solid. I didn't, have a huge reaction to it, but was really intrigued by this project as it's pretty explicitly connected to his work in the Mars Hill podcast and the story that he did there. And I just was really interested in if there was anything new he was bringing to this book. And I'm very not pleasantly surprised. I'm very glad to report that this does bring something new to it. And so the main idea here is he is doing some cultural theory, some philosophical work to identify what it is that has co-opted, you could say, a lot of the evangelical movement in American culture, or broadly Western culture, you could say. He is trying to put his finger on and give language to what is behind so many of the scandals, the power mongering, the abuse, that's caused all this trauma and spiritual damage in the wake of all these church leaders and church movements that have collapsed around us. So he's trying to dig into that and understand it better through, in particular, the theoretical work and philosophical work of Hannah Arendt. And also a little bit of Charles Taylor, but mostly Arendt is what he brings to this book. And this book is framed in two sections. The first section it's called Understanding Dark Times and Resisting Dark Times. The understanding section is a lot more of the descriptive kind of archaeological work to figure out what's happening culturally, and that's mostly where, although he relies on Arendt through really the whole thing, but a lot of that kind of theoretical work is done in the first half. And the important thing I want to say here is that he diagnoses what's going on as the influence of ideology. So he defines ideology with the help of Arendt. He talks about the allure of ideology. He talks about why ideology is so attractive in our time, being a time of a lot of meaninglessness and rootlessness and anxiety. And why are we primed, we being humans, why are we primed to grasp onto ideology? Ideology, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but he essentially uses Arendt's definition of ideology, which is kind of a simplistic story, a monocausal story that not only describes everything that's wrong in the world, but also promises an elegant, clean solution to it. That's kind of what an ideology is, according to his work with Arendt. And so we're not only is ideology a thing, but also we're maybe uniquely primed to grasp onto ideology. And his argument is that the church, Mars Hill being a case study in this, but the evangelical church broadly is really, and probably more than we'd like to admit, has glommed onto ideology as a way of being in the world, an ideology as a way of existing, which is in conflict with the mission the church has been given by the scriptures in the New Testament, especially. And so that's his case that he's making in the first part of the book, is understanding the dark times we're in and how ideology functions within that time, and also how the church is tempted to give into ideology as its way of functioning. And then the second it's not really the second half. It's more like 2/3 and 1/3, but the last third is more constructive, which is to say how to resist the allure of ideology in our time. And so he talks about people like Eugene Peterson as a kind of, or Dallas Willard also shows up, two heroes of mine in particular. And he talks about practices like solitude, practices of worship, practice of thinking clearly, practice of storytelling. These are ways he proposes to resist the allure of ideology. And so that's what the Church in Dark Times is about, is it cultural diagnosis, constructive, positive proposals for practices to resist the diagnosis he lays out. So the research behind that then, I've already talked a lot, I've alluded to a lot of the research here. He does probably the most in-depth work with Arendt. He also pulls on Charles Taylor, especially when he's talking about the rootlessness and kind of malaise of modernity, which is Charles Taylor's term. He talks about, he uses some of Taylor's work in some of talking about why modernity is prone towards ideologies, which I thought was really helpful. And I also really liked on the kind of the back half of the book, I really liked pulling on people like Peterson and Dallas Willard that I've already mentioned. Also, he does, I should say, on the research side, he definitely very explicitly brings in the Mars Hill story. So he kind of builds on, there's nothing new per se. If you listen to the podcast, you're not going to learn anything new about the Mars Hill story, but there is a little bit more depth, and he uses it as a case study, case study example, I guess, for how can ideology function in a system like what happened at Mars Hill, where people who would ostensibly never want to do anything abusive, nevertheless, when an ideology kind of takes over a system, everyone's complicit in abusive outcomes because of the way ideology functions in that kind of simplistic monocausal way, to bulldoze over people towards the mission or the vision. So he uses Mars Hill as almost an aspect of his research, like all the work he did for that podcast plays into the research of the book, and he uses it, I think, very helpfully as to flesh out examples of kind of the theoretical work he's doing here. So yeah, that's a little bit on the research. It is really explicitly a lot focused on Hannah Arendt, and he's upfront about that from the very beginning, that she's had a major impact on him and actually been a companion for him to help him understand what's going on with his ideology. And if you don't know who Hannah Arendt is, he does a good job at kind of contextualizing her, and as she's responsible for that very, very well-known phrase, the banality of evil. She was present for the Eichmann trials when it came to post-World War II, when he was captured and put on trial in front of the world. That's where she got that phrase. He has a really good chapter on the banality of evil, actually getting into the nuances of what that actually means. Anyways, that's who Hannah Arendt is. That's his main kind of research, I guess, dialogue partner, you could say, conversation partner in terms of research in this book, this project. So that's what's behind it. The readability of it, I mean, gosh, this is like, I just downed this book. Well, very positive reaction to this book, as you might be able to tell by my energy in this review, but part of it is the readability. It just goes down so smooth. It's so easily readable. It's not overly long at all. He does, I think, deep work with the theoretical foundations. Some could say, I like reading big, long, heady books, so I actually maybe would have liked some more pages on Charles Taylor, for example, maybe even like flesh out some of that some more. But I think this book is very economically written, very compellingly written. The structure, the way that he does the theoretical work at the beginning, and I love that there's positive proposals, and I think the positive proposals are really, really helpful and practical and compelling. I like that it's both descriptive and prescriptive in that sense. I think it's all really readable. The chapters are not overly long. The ideas are very digestible and understandable. Yeah, I think it's excellently written, is kind of the simplest way I could put it. It's very compelling, I think very persuasive. And that leads up to my reaction. I really loved this book. This is my absolute favorite thing that Mike Cosper has done. I've followed him since the podcast. I appreciate the work he's doing with Christianity Today. I appreciate his involvement in podcasts like The Bulletin. I appreciate his perspective on many things. This is my favorite thing he's done. I really, really, really resonated with this book and resonated with the conclusions he brought to it. I found myself, and I should say this, I might be having an overly personal kind of resonance or reaction to this because of the ministry settings I've been in and around in various ways. I have had a lot of tension around the way that persuasion, the way that mission and the way that vision statements have functioned in certain Christian settings that I've been in. I've experienced a lot of, I've experienced undue pressure to achieve certain outcomes. I've experienced a lot of the negative kind of secondary effects of things that he's talking about here. And so I just found myself, that's a personal experience I have. And I found myself when he's talking about ideology, I mean, he uses the phrase at one point after defining ideology. He says in the church or in parachurch organizations or whatever, he says we don't call it ideology, we call it a mission statement. And I was underlining and starring and saying yes, because he was pushing the diagnosis, I think, in a very clear and succinct way to put some words to exactly the things that I had experienced. I had experienced mission statements as veiled ideology, really. Simplistic narratives, meaning-making stories that actually flatten some of the mysteries and contradictions and tensions that are inherent in the work that ministry actually is. And it just resonated with me so personally and so deeply that I was just loving what he was doing with that concept. And he does it very thoughtfully. He does a very, very good discussions on how the tension between, yes, Christianity does believe it has, in a sense, the overarching narrative of the world. Christianity believes that in the gospel and the biblical meta-narrative are kind of the story of history and the story of where all humans are going, but he does really good work at differentiating and distinguishing that from ideology and how ideology functions, and how Christianity maintains room for mystery and the limits of our knowing. Even the scripture that says, we see through a glass darkly, we don't understand everything. When ideology seeps into a religious or Christian institution or setting, it doesn't leave room for those kinds of mysteries, right? Oops, I just dropped my book. So I loved all of that work. It resonated with me very powerfully. I underlined so many passages. I starred so many passages. I thought both the descriptive side, diagnosing ideology and how it functions, was thoughtfully done. I thought his work with Taylor was really solid. But what I want to say is that even if that's all the book was, just a diagnosis, just a work of cultural theory, it would be really helpful and successful. But the fact that he pairs it with these really compelling practices at the end, the chapter on solitude and thinking, I hear solitude put forward a lot, especially in our busy, noisy age. People talk about solitude is such an important practice. Solitude is such an important practice, and it is. But the way he pairs it with the effort to resist ideology was very, personally compelling to me. I was really affected by that practice, and I kind of framed the idea of solitude in a new way, as to say, solitude is a practice to resist the allure of ideology, which is so tempting because we live in such an anxious, rootless age. And so I'm a pastor, and as a leader in a ministry setting, it was really convicting to me to think about how do I maintain a posture of resistance against the allure of ideology, because it is tempting to grasp onto a simplistic narrative, to motivate people, to rally people to a cause, to give them meaning, to push back on anxiety and rootlessness in our time by grasping onto something that's actually not the gospel or not biblically faithful in the form of ideology. And so I love that chapter, and his chapter on worship and his chapter on storytelling. I mean, so good, so personally helpful to me. This is my favorite thing that Cosper's done. I highly recommend it to anyone that's invested in the success and the health of the church, particularly if you're in a Protestant evangelical kind of casual low church setting that, in my view, is maybe uniquely susceptible to strongmen leaders, so to speak, or ideological kind of temptations, mission-driven ways to animate people towards a cause. If you're in anything like that setting or adjacent to that setting, I highly recommend this book. Highly recommend this book to pastors, to parachurch leaders. I think there's a lot of really helpful things here, and he's framing things and linking them to certain thinkers in ways that I don't see other people doing, or at least I'm not aware of ways that other people are doing them in the same way. And and he's got the experience in the work that he did on the work that he's done in his personal ministry life, and also the journalistic reporting he's done. I mean, he just brings all these things together in a way that I think is very fruitful and extremely helpful, and extremely. I found this book, and this may be the last thing I'll say. The Church in Dark Times is a dark title, but I did not find this book discouraging or defeatist. Actually, surprisingly, I found it encouraging. I found it enlivening, just personally to me. And I think that's probably the highest compliment I can give it. So yeah, I'm kind of gushing at this point. I'm gonna wrap this review here. You've hopefully gotten a sense of what this book is about and why it spoke to me so powerfully. If you're someone who has my story or story related to mine, I strongly suspect you're gonna get a lot out of this book, and I would highly commend it to you. So those are my thoughts on Mike Cosper's new project, Brazos Press new book, The Church in Dark Times. Thanks as always for taking a few minutes to watch.